Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to leave the sealed rooms of Boston's oldest houses. If you hear a faint knocking while this plays, if the air in your room seems to press tighter against your chest, it's because you've stepped into knowledge men have bled to protect. The Thorne family's secret was not a ghost story. It was flesh and blood and silence weaponized across generations. To hear it is to touch the raw edge of power, the kind that smiles in daylight while strangling its own in the dark. Beacon Hill, 1891. A city of gaslight, carriages, and glittering wealth. Boston's elite, known as the Brahmins, paraded through polished avenues under the illusion of permanence. They were families who measured themselves not in years, but in centuries. To belong among them was to inherit scrutiny like a birthright. Every movement weighed, every word inspected, every marriage arranged not for love, but for the preservation of legacy. And in that rigid order, the Thorne family stood untouchable. At least, that's what the world was allowed to see. The mansion itself was a fortress of appearances. Red brick walls rose with an authority that seemed eternal, windows framed in white stone like watchful eyes. Its iron balconies were not built for pleasure, but for permanence. Oil portraits of dead ancestors stared from the walls, their eyes like frozen verdicts passed down to the living. Within those halls, every step, every whisper, every guest list was chosen with precision. Because Elias Thorne, the patriarch, believed the family name was not his possession, but his weapon, and for a weapon to hold power, it must never show weakness. That was the obsession that birthed Boston's most disturbing secret. You see, the Thornes did not merely fear scandal, they annihilated it. They believed imperfection itself was treason. Elias Thorne polished his public eye, mage with the same cold calculation he used to lock away his children. Yes, children, 2 of them, Silas and Beatrice. They were not dead, though the city was told otherwise. They were alive, breathing, learning, playing, and caged in the attic above Beacon Hill's most admired dinners, not to protect them, but to erase them. Imagine it, the chandeliers below glittering with opulence, laughter rising from crystal glasses, while only one staircase away, 2 small voices pressed against barred windows, wondering why the world did not see them. Their crime? They were not perfect. To Elias, their existence threatened the bloodline, and in Boston's Brahmin class, reputation was more sacred than flesh. Eleanor Thorne, the mother, carried the wound of that silence every day of her life. Guests praised her poise, her gowns, her grace, but if you watched closely, her eyes betrayed her, always drifting upward toward the ceiling, toward the rooms she could not acknowledge. She slipped away from dinners to bring books and toys to her hidden children, whispering lullabies that tore her soul in half. To society, she was a porcelain hostess. In secret, she was a mother shackled by complicity. Every smile she gave in public was another betrayal upstairs. And their elder son, Alistair Thorne, the heir presented to the world, grew up with a mansion that spoke more in silence than in sound. He learned early never to ask why certain doors were locked, why the house moaned at night with sounds too human to be wind. His father molded him into perfection, Harvard-educated, eloquent, a future politician. Yet beneath that polish, Alistair carried a hollow weight, an unspoken truth haunting his every word. He was raised not only by his parents, but by the absences they carved into the house itself. A man destined to lead, yet trained to ignore what breathed just above his head. The servants knew, houses like this always whisper their truths to those who clean them. Agnes, the housekeeper, was a girl when she entered service. She grew into a woman under the Thornes' roof, polishing silver until it blinded the eye, pressing silence into every corner. She was present the day Eleanor gave birth to the children Boston would never see. She saw Elias's rigid face, heard Eleanor's sobs, and knew instantly that these children would never be allowed downstairs. Her Catholic faith demanded confession, but what priest could absolve silence like this? She buried it deep. Year after year, she dusted chandeliers while hearing footsteps above, and each rosary bead she touched became heavier than stone. Now imagine the house itself. The attic was no neglected garret. Elias ensured it was orderly, sustained, disguised as a nursery, but a prison all the same. Iron bars sealed the windows, daylight rationed like a punishment, wooden toys lined in perfect rows, books chosen carefully to educate but never liberate. The children were clothed, fed, and kept clean, but they were not allowed to exist. This is not neglect. This is control so meticulous it masquerades as care, the cruelty of silence refined into ritual. Boston admired Elias Thorne as a man of philanthropy, of civic leadership, of charitable boards and Harvard speeches. But behind his composure was a tyranny of appearances. He donated, he spoke, he smiled, not to uplift, but to erase suspicion. Every public gesture was a veil. Every coin given to the poor was blood money, meant to buy silence from the city. And it worked. No scandal ever reached the newspapers. No whisper ever tainted the Thorne name. The dynasty endured because 2 children were erased behind locked doors. Understand this, the most dangerous men in history are not the ones who rage. They are the ones who control. Elias Thorne did not need chains of iron. His chains were silence, reputation, and fear. He built a fortress of appearances so flawless that Boston bowed to him, never knowing he was devouring his own bloodline to keep the illusion alive. And you listening now, this is where the descent begins. Because once you know this, you cannot unknow it. Once you hear the voices behind the locked doors of Beacon Hill, you will begin to hear them everywhere, in institutions, in governments, in corporations, secrets hidden, not because they are supernatural, but because they are too human, too close, too damning. Power does not scream, it whispers. And Elias Thorne understood that better than any man in Boston. His empire of silence was not simply a family matter, it was a strategy refined over generations of Brahmin rule. When you walk among the gravestones of New England's founding elite, you are not looking at fathers and mothers. You are looking at a lineage of guardians, guardians of image, guardians of order, guardians of their own authority disguised as morality. Elias carried this mantle with a devotion that bordered on madness. To him, even a child could be an enemy if that child threatened the illusion of perfection. What does it do to a man when his love for his family is twisted into obsession with their image? He becomes a priest of appearances, sacrificing flesh for reputation. That is exactly what Elias became. To Boston, he was philanthropy incarnate, endowments at Harvard, pews at church, silver poured into charities. But beneath every signature on every check was fear. Fear that if anyone glimpsed the truth inside his mansion, the entire Brahmin facade might collapse, and with it centuries of control. His donations were not generosity. They were insurance. A man like Elias did not give. He paid. Inside his house, the ritual of silence was more suffocating than any chain. Servants moved like shadows, trained to avert their eyes when Eleanor drifted upstairs with books or toys. They knew never to linger near the attic staircase. To break silence was to break covenant, and Elias enforced that covenant without raising his voice. His power was the pause, the glance, the weight of expectation that crushed without striking. Men like him never needed to shout. They could destroy with a whisper withheld. But silence does not only protect, it corrodes, and the first to bear its weight were the children. Silas and Beatrice. They were not feral, nor forgotten. They were educated, clothed, and fed. But to live without acknowledgement is to live as half a person. Their lives were a paradox, meticulously maintained, yet brutally erased. Imagine being taught to read, yet never allowed to write your name on paper that leaves the room. Imagine knowing fairy tales but never seeing another child's face. Imagine hearing parties below, music and laughter, and realizing those sounds are proof of the world you will never enter. Silas grew restless before his sister. He was older, stronger, and already understood the bars on the windows were not for safety, but for exile. He pressed against them until his fingers blistered, until the iron cut his skin. His anger boiled in mutterings, sounds that sometimes slipped into guttural cries the servants mistook for wind beat. Rice, smaller, quieter, became the mirror of her mother. She absorbed silence like a sponge, folding her loneliness into imagination. She spoke to her dolls as though they were guests at dinners, mimicking voices she heard through the floorboards, but even her games betrayed the truth. Every story she acted out ended with the same line: "We mustn't be seen." Do you see the genius of Elias Thorne's cruelty? He didn't chain them with neglect. He raised them with just enough care to sustain their bodies while starving their souls. In his mind, this was preservation, not of them, but of the family. And so, in the flicker of gaslight, 2 children were sculpted not into heirs, but into shadows. Eleanor bore it like a woman trapped between 2 graves. To her peers, she was perfection incarnate. To her children, she was both savior and betrayer. Each night she crept to the attic, whispering that it was for their own good, that someday they would understand. But her hands trembled as she said it. Her diary, hidden in a rosewood drawer, records her torment. "I carry the weight of silence. I bring them bread, but I cannot bring them life." Every page was a confession without absolution. She did not dare write the children's names. Even ink could betray them. Agnes, the housekeeper, carried her own torment. She had served long enough to know that silence is not passive. It's poison. Each day she held her tongue, she felt another piece of herself rot. She would kneel at night, rosary clutched, and wonder whether God himself had turned away from the Thorne's attic. But she stayed. Why? Because survival is its own prison. The wages she earned, the position she held, the fear Elias instilled, these were chains as strong as iron. She could leave, but she would leave with nothing. So she chose silence, and silence chose her. The mansion itself became a living accomplice. Its corridors swallowed sound. Its portrait stared down every attempt at rebellion. At night, the building seemed to breathe with the voices Elias tried to suppress. Bostoners passing in carriages sometimes swore they heard faint notes rising from the windows, like a song half-formed. They dismissed it in daylight, of course. Everything is easier to dismiss in daylight, but the whispers always returned at night. And this is where the story grows darker, because Elias Thorne was not unique. He was an expression of something larger, something that still haunts every institution of power today. The idea that image matters more than truth, that appearances justify cruelty. That silence can erase lives. The Thornes were not an isolated family. They were a microcosm of the machinery of control. Do you think governments, corporations, and churches have not built their own attics? Do you think there are not voices locked away even now, sacrificed to preserve the illusion of order? This is where men like you must make a choice. To hear this story is to confront yourself, because the question is not whether Elias Thorne existed. He did. The question is whether you will recognize his reflection in the institutions that surround you today. You can dismiss it, you can laugh, call it just another Gothic tale, or you can let it in, let it scratch at the edges of your mind until you realize the truth. You've been raised in a mansion too, a mansion of appearances, of rules unspoken, of doors locked before you ever knew to ask what was behind them. And here's the danger. Once you hear the voices in the attic, you cannot return to silence. Once you realize the Thorne's secret, you begin to recognize the same patterns everywhere. Hidden rooms, concealed truths, lives sacrificed to protect legacies that never cared for them. This is why I speak to you now, not to entertain, but to awaken. Knowledge is dangerous, but ignorance is slavery. And Elias Thorne mastered slavery without ever calling it by name. He called it family, he called it duty, he called it preservation. But what it truly was erasure. And now you have heard the beginning of that erasure. The question is, will you remain silent like the servants, or will you continue down the staircase into the forbidden, where silence breaks and the truth finally screams? Boston, in the late 19th century, was a city draped in candlelight respectability, its brick facades and ivy-covered halls whispering promises of civility and intellect. But beneath that polished veneer pulsed a network of silent agreements, a covenant of concealment that extended far beyond the Thorne mansion. Elias was not merely a tyrant in his home, he was a priest in a larger temple, the temple of appearances maintained by Boston's elite. And every temple, no matter how gilded, is built on sacrifice. When Elias walked into church on Sundays, no one dared meet his eyes too long. They nodded, smiled, murmured blessings, but behind their gestures lay unspoken recognition. They all had secrets. Each family carried a burden they dared not let the world see. A son addicted to opium, a daughter pregnant out of wedlock, a cousin who had lost the family fortune in gambling. The key to survival in this society was not purity. It was silence. And Elias, with his iron will and reputation for perfection, was the high priest of silence. The ministers knew. Of course they knew. A city's clergy always knows the sins of its pillars, but knowledge without action is complicity. The church relied on Elias's donations to maintain its roof, its organs, its schools. To call him out would have been financial suicide. Better to preach of original sin in generalities, to thunder about damnation in the abstract, than to risk offending the man whose silver lined the collection plate. So the clergy became co-conspirators in silence, cloaking their cowardice in scripture. The universities knew as well. Harvard prided itself on being the seat of rational thought, of enlightenment, of the Republic's intellectual soul. But Harvard was also a hungry beast. It needed endowments, land, patronage. Elias sat on committees, signed checks, steered influence. To the professors, he was the ideal benefactor, cultured, wealthy, discreet. What scandal could be worth jeopardizing a benefactor of his caliber? So they buried whispers beneath Latin phrases, cloaked complicity in scholarship, and turned away from the faint rumors that sometimes reached their ears. Even the newspapers knew. Boston's presses thrived on scandal. Murders, affairs, political corruption. But there was an unwritten rule. You did not print the sins of Brahmins. The cost was too high. A paper that crossed Elias would find its advertisers gone, its invitations rescinded, its reputation shredded. Editors understood that silence was not just survival, it was currency. The truth was, for the poor, the powerful were afforded myth. Do you see the pattern? Elias was not a solitary monster. He was a keystone in an arch of silence, and without men like him, the entire edifice of Boston's respectability would crumble. His cruelty was not only tolerated, it was required. The city needed his facade. His family's erasure was the price of stability. Meanwhile, inside the attic, Silas's rebellion grew. His fists battered the wooden walls, his voice sometimes erupting in guttural howls that echoed through the beams. Neighbors passing on cobblestone streets swore they heard strange cries drifting from the Thorne estate, but these were dismissed as superstition. After all, who would dare accuse Elias Thorne of harboring madness? The mind is expert at dismissing what it cannot bear to confront. Beatrice, in contrast, grew quieter. Her imagination expanded inward, constructing vast kingdoms in her mind. She fashioned entire worlds from the shadows of lamplight, gave names to the cracks in the ceiling, invented companions no one else could see. Silence did not crush her, it absorbed her, but the cost of such absorption was erasure of self. A child cannot grow into a voice when every whisper is forbidden. She became a vessel for silence, a living echo of her mother's resignation. And yet, even as the children were reshaped, Elias's control was not absolute. Cracks began to form, not in the attic walls, but in the minds of those who enforced his rule. Agnes, the housekeeper, found herself pausing longer at the attic door. She would place bread down and linger, straining to hear Beatrice's soft humming. That humming, so fragile, so human, cut through her like a blade. She began to wonder, what if silence itself was the true sin? What if, by keeping her lips sealed, she was condemning not only the children, but her own soul? Eleanor, too, began to shift. At first, she had accepted Elias's logic, that exposure meant ruin, that silence meant safety. But with each passing year, guilt hollowed her. She saw the children's eyes when she entered the attic, eyes that no longer glowed with recognition, but stared like mirrors, reflecting her betrayal. Her diary entries became darker. One reads, "My hands bring them food, but my silence brings them death. I dream of fire consuming this house and pray the flames might set us free." These cracks, however, were invisible to Elias. In his mind, control was eternal. His rituals, his donations, his alliances with clergy and university and press, these were armor. He believed himself untouchable, the very embodiment of Boston's unassailable class. But arrogance blinds, and every fortress, no matter how strong, carries within it the seeds of collapse. The collapse began not with a shout, but with a whisper. Agnes confided her unease to a cousin in secret, speaking only in hints, never names. But hints have power. They spread like embers carried on wind, igniting imaginations, fueling suspicions. Boston society loved silence, yes, but it also loved gossip. And gossip is silence's tway, and its shadow self. For every secret buried, there is a rumor that claws its way toward daylight. Soon whispers reached ears outside the Thorne circle. A physician who occasionally visited the mansion noted the peculiar absence of children in the family's public life. A neighbor wondered why the attic windows never opened, even in summer. A servant who left the household spoke vaguely of strange cries and rooms forbidden. The rumors did not yet coalesce into truth, but they hovered like storm clouds. Elias tightened control in response. He dismissed servants, restricted access, doubled his donations to church and university. His philanthropy grew more flamboyant as his fear deepened. But generosity cannot erase whispers, it only fertilizes them. The more he tried to polish his reputation, the more people wondered what tarnish he was hiding. And so, the machinery of silence began to falter. For centuries, Boston's elite had thrived on concealment, but the Thorne secret was too grotesque, too haunting, to stay hidden forever. The attic was not just a room, it was a prophecy. It foretold the collapse of an entire system that placed image above humanity. The truth, once whispered, is never fully contained. It seeps under doors, slides through cracks, rides on the breath of servants, neighbors, strangers. Elias believed silence was eternal. He forgot that silence itself is fragile. It only takes one voice to shatter it, and that voice was about to rise. Rumors are not born fully formed. They creep. They begin as shadows in conversation, glances exchanged too quickly, fragments overheard in taverns or whispered in pews. The Thorne family secret moved like this, an infection without a name. It slithered through Boston's drawing rooms, past marble columns and velvet curtains, until it reached people who could not ignore it. At first it was simple. Why are there no children at Thorne gatherings? That was the seed. In Boston, family was currency. Marriages, alliances, legacies, all depended on the visibility of heirs. For Elias and Eleanor to appear year after year without their son and daughter was an anomaly too striking to ignore. Excuses were given, of course. The children were delicate, the winters too harsh, the summers too damp. But repetition breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds story. A physician named Dr. Ambrose Pickering became the first outsider to question more openly. He had visited the Thorne estate under pretense of treating Eleanor's nerves. He noticed how her hands shook, how her eyes darted toward the ceiling when Elias wasn't watching. He noted, too, the peculiar creaking above, the shuffle of feet that did not belong to servants. Physicians in those days were not only doctors, but repositories of secrets, keepers of family shame. Pickering carried his observations in silence, but silence is heavy, and heavy things eventually fall. Pickering confided in a colleague, Dr. Samuel Merriweather. The words were cautious, shrouded in professional concern. The Thornes may harbor a situation best left unspoken. But Merriweather, unlike Pickering, enjoyed the currency of gossip. He shared the insinuation at a dinner table. That table included a journalist, and thus the ember glowed. The press was hungry. In the late 19th century, newspapers competed like predators. They thrived on scandal, each headline more lurid than the last. For decades, Boston's Brahmins had been largely immune, but immunity does not last forever. One paper, the Boston Courier, decided to test the waters. They printed a cryptic piece, never naming Elias, but describing a certain family of renown whose heirs are kept from sight, hidden in upper rooms, their voices muffled by the weight of reputation. Boston exploded. Readers whispered. Who could it be? Some suspected other families, but Elias felt the blow immediately. Though unnamed, he knew the reference pointed like a dagger at his house. Silence was no longer a shield, It had become a target. Elias responded the only way he knew, by tightening control. He forbade Eleanor from writing her diary, confiscated the key to her rosewood drawer. He forbade Agnes from approaching the attic except at designated hours, stripping her of even those brief moments of human connection. He prowled the mansion at night, candle in hand, inspecting doors and windows as though his children might burst forth like spectres. But fear breeds mistakes. And Elias, in his desperation, began to overplay his hand. He increased his presence in public, attending every gala, every church service, every civic meeting. He spoke louder, donated more, smiled wider. To many, it looked like confidence, but to those who watched closely it was frantic, a man performing virtue to drown out suspicion. Meanwhile, the attic grew restless. Silas sensed change, though no one told him. He felt the shift in his father's pacing, the crackle of tension in his mother's voice. He began to throw himself harder against the walls, as if he could force them to yield. Beatrice, ever quieter, began to write her own messages in chalk on the floorboards. Words like help, outside, air. The servants who glimpsed them when cleaning dared not speak, but the images etched themselves into their memories. Agnes, more tormented than ever, began to dream of betrayal. Not betrayal of the children, but of Elias. She imagined walking to the church and whispering truth to the priest. She imagined leaving a letter under the door of the newspaper office. Her hands trembled as she scrubbed floors, torn between fear and salvation. Her silence was no longer loyalty. It was cowardice, and she knew it. The breaking point came at a party. The Thornes hosted a grand dinner to quash suspicion, filling their ballroom with politicians, scholars, clergy, and merchants. Music played, glasses clinked, laughter swirled. But as the night deepened, a sound drifted through the floorboards, a low, muffled pounding. At first it was mistaken for music, but then it came again, sharper, more insistent. A pause rippled through the room. Elias froze. Eleanor's glass shattered in her hand. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some dismissed it, but others could not. One whispered, "Do you hear it? From above?" Elias laughed too loudly, clapped for more music, drowned the moment in champagne. But whispers cannot be drowned. They only grow when forced under. The next morning, the Boston Courier ran a second piece. This time the wording was sharper. Voices in the walls of a mansion where heirs are unseen. How long can silence keep them? Still no names, but the city's gossip converged. Everyone knew the Thornes were exposed. The walls of Elias's empire shook. Clergy who had once accepted his donations grew nervous, distancing themselves. Harvard men whispered about unfortunate matters and quietly discussed limiting Elias's influence. The newspapers circled like sharks, smelling blood in the water. And in the mansion itself, silence no longer suffocated, it screamed. Eleanor reached her breaking point. That night, she crept to the attic, clutching her diary. Her hands shook as she placed it in Beatrice's lap. "If anyone finds this," she whispered, "they will know you lived." Her tears fell onto the pages. Silas grabbed her arm, eyes burning, and hissed, "Let us out." For the first time, Eleanor did not say no. Elias, returning from his study, caught her at the door, his face contorted, not with rage, but with terror. He slammed the attic shut, dragged Eleanor down the stairs, and in a voice like thunder hissed, "You will not betray us." But his words betrayed him. He was no longer master of silence. He was its prisoner, lashing out at the cracks forming in its walls. The storm had arrived. Boston smelled scandal. Elias's allies wavered, and his family's secret was now an open wound. The only question left was not whether the truth would come out, but how much destruction it would cause when it did. And in the attic, Silas whispered to his sister, "The house is breaking. Soon they will hear us." Power never collapses all at once. It unravels thread by thread, as those who once clung to it decide it is safer to let go. For Elias Thorne, the unraveling began the moment his peers smelled weakness. The whispers in Boston no longer carried a question. They carried an accusation. And when accusation hangs in the air, silence becomes complicit. The clergy were the first to retreat. Father Hilliard, who had once praised Elias in sermons, began speaking of hidden sins within even the loftiest households. He did not name the Thornes, but the timing was no coincidence. Parishioners nodded gravely, their eyes shifting toward Elias's pew. For decades the church had sheltered him. Now it dangled him as a cautionary tale, a warning that even the mighty could fall. The collection plate still accepted his silver, but the warmth of fellowship was gone. He sat in the pews like a ghost, the whispers of the congregation cutting deeper than any blade. The universities followed. At Harvard, Elias had been a patron of lectures, libraries, scholarships, but intellectuals are skilled at self-preservation. Behind oak doors, professors debated whether continued association with him endangered their institution's reputation. Minutes from one faculty meeting record the phrase, "The generosity of certain benefactors may be outweighed by the liabilities of their private affairs." In the coded language of academia, this was a death sentence. Soon, Elias's invitations dwindled. His name was omitted from lists. He remained wealthy, but in Boston's intellectual sphere, he had become radioactive. The press smelled blood and struck. The Boston Courier escalated its campaign, running a series of increasingly bold articles. Still careful not to name him, they described the hidden heirs, the muffled cries, the mother torn between duty and despair. Readers needed no names. Everyone knew. Rival papers joined in, no longer fearing reprisal. The Thornes were front-page whispers, their mansion reduced to rumor and metaphor. Boston loved nothing more than to devour its own, and Elias was now a feast. Inside the mansion, the collapse was louder. Silas no longer paced. He pounded. Each night his fists battered the attic walls until the wood shook. The servants downstairs pretended not to hear, but their eyes betrayed them. Beatrice, though quieter, began to sing, not softly as before, but in trembling, wavering notes that carried through the rafters. Her voice was thin, but it was enough. One guest, passing on the street, swore he heard a child's lullaby leaking from the shuttered windows. He told his wife. His wife told her sister. Within a week, the city buzzed with the rumor of the attic voices. Eleanor broke under the weight. She had once convinced herself silence was mercy. Now it was a coffin. Her diary, entrusted to Beatrice, became her weapon. She began writing more frantically, recording details she had once been too afraid to put in ink. The day Silas first begged to see the garden, the moment Beatrice traced the word heir on the floorboards, the night Elias forbade her from touching her own children's hair. Each page was a scream in ink, a rebellion bound in leather. She told herself, if I cannot free them, perhaps these words can. Agnes, too, neared breaking. She could no longer endure the children's eyes when she brought bread. Their silence condemned her. She began speaking in prayer louder, deliberately, as though God himself needed to hear what Elias tried to bury. And in her prayers, she began naming the children, not only to God, but to anyone who might overhear. It was reckless, dangerous, but the dam had already cracked. Silence no longer served her, it suffocated her. Elias, blind to the inevitability of collapse, believed he could still outwit rumor. He summoned lawyers, threatened suits against newspapers, accused rivals of slander. He commissioned portraits, donated land, gave speeches dripping with piety. But each act of defense only sharpened suspicion. The harder he fought to prove virtue, the more grotesque the whispers became. People said the children were diseased, monstrous, insane. Others said they had been born malformed and hidden away like shameful relics. The truth, 2 living, breathing children locked in silence, was almost more horrifying than the rumors. One evening Elias stormed into the attic. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "Do you hear them?" He spat at Silas and Beatrice. "Do you hear the city clawing at our walls?" Silas glared back, unflinching, his eyes burning with something Elias could not name. Beatrice whispered only one word: free. It was the first time she had ever spoken directly. To him. Elias struck the wall, his fist leaving splinters, but he could not strike her. In that moment, for the first time, he saw what he had created, not shadows, but witnesses. Outside the mansion, the city gathered its appetite. Neighbors lingered near the iron gates, staring at the shuttered windows. Journalists loitered, sketching outlines of the house for their columns. Carriages slowed as whispers filled the air. The Thornes had become spectacle. Silence had turned to theatre, and Boston demanded its performance. It was Agnes who finally cracked. One night she left the house under pretense of visiting her sister. Instead, she carried a folded letter in her apron, written in a hand that shook but did not falter. It contained no embellishment, only truth. There are children in the attic. They have been kept there all their lives. They are alive. She slid it under the door of the Boston Courier. By morning the paper had its story. This time it named names. Elias Thorne was no longer a whispered shadow. He was front-page scandal. The hidden children of Beacon Hill. Silence of the Thorne mansion. The article detonated. Crowds gathered outside the estate. Clergy called for investigation. Harvard cut ties. Neighbors gawked as police carriages arrived, officers pounding on the great mahogany doors. Elias tried to hold them off, waving legal documents, declaring invasion of privacy. But the walls he had built for decades were crumbling. The attic was no longer his secret. It belonged to the world. Inside, Silas pressed his ear to the door as boots thundered up the stairs. Beatrice clutched the diary against her chest. For the first time in their lives, the silence that had defined them was about to shatter, and Elias, standing at the foot of the staircase, realized the truth he had spent his life denying. Silence does not preserve power, it only delays its collapse. The door to the attic shuddered. The city was at the gates. The Thornes' secret, once buried in whispers, was about to scream into daylight. The pounding at the attic door was unlike anything Silas and Beatrice had ever heard. For years, knocks had meant food trays, whispers from their mother, or the sound of Agnes's footsteps retreating into the silence. But these were not whispers. These were fists, boots, the voices of men shouting commands in tones that carried authority beyond their father's control. "Stand back!" a voice barked. The children froze. They were not used to voices directed at them. Silas pressed Beatrice behind him, shielding her like he had since childhood, his thin body taut with both fear and anticipation. The wood groaned under the force, splinters scattering. Beatrice clutched Eleanor's diary tighter against her chest, as though the words inside might protect her from the storm about to enter. Downstairs, Elias stood rigid at the base of the staircase, arms outstretched, barking in protest. "You will not defile my home. You will not drag my family into your spectacle." But his words, once iron, now sounded brittle. The officers ignored him. The city had demanded truth, and no patriarch, no committee, no lineage could silence it. The door shattered inward. Light from the corridor flooded into the attic, brighter than the children had ever seen. Dust swirled like smoke, and for a moment the figures in the doorway looked like giants, backlit and terrible. Silas hissed, not in rage, but in defense, shielding his sister, his eyes stinging from the sudden glare. Beatrice whimpered, the first sound she had made in the presence of strangers. The officers froze. They had expected ghosts, perhaps corpses. What they saw instead were children, thin, pale, trembling, their eyes wide as if daylight itself were a predator. One officer lowered his weapon. Another muttered, "God have mercy." The silence in that room was heavier than any scream. Eleanor rushed forward, breaking through the wall of uniforms before Elias could stop her. She fell to her knees before her children, clutching them, weeping openly, her hands trembling as they touched their faces. For years, she had offered them scraps of comfort in the shadows. Now, before the eyes of the law, she clung to them with a desperation stripped of secrecy. "My babies, my loves," she sobbed, her voice cracking with decades of buried grief. Beatrice buried her face in her mother's neck, inhaling the scent of perfume mixed with tears. Silas, however, glared past Eleanor, fixing his gaze on Elias. The father he had known only through absence now stood framed by the stairwell, his face ashen, his jaw clenched. For the first time, Silas saw not the ruler of the house, but a man cornered, diminished, stripped of control. And in that instant, the boy who had been caged all his life became something more. He became witness, accuser, the living embodiment of Elias's failure. The officers led the children down the stairs. Each step creaked with the weight of revelation. Servants huddled in corners, weeping openly, some crossing themselves, others staring in shame. Neighbors pressed against the iron gates outside, gasping as the children emerged. The crowd surged forward, mothers clutching their sons, fathers shaking their heads in disbelief. God above! He kept them there. One man muttered, another shouted, "Shame! Shame upon the Thornes!" Reporters scribbled furiously, sketching the pale faces of the children, recording every tremble of their limbs, every flicker of horror in their eyes. The forbidden secret had become public spectacle. Silas and Beatrice, who had been raised in silence, were now thrust into the roar of a city's judgment. Elias followed, his composure cracking. "You know not what you do," he bellowed at the crowd. "You know nothing of duty, of sacrifice. This family has held this city together for generations, and you—" His words were drowned by jeers. Eggs were thrown, stones clattered against the gates. For once, his silence was not enough. Eleanor begged the officers to let her remain with the children. "Do not separate us," she pleaded. "Please, they need me." Her voice carried a sincerity that pierced even the hardened hearts of the law. They allowed her to ride with them in the carriage, her arms wrapped around Silas and Beatrice, while Elias was held back, detained by force, his protests echoing hollowly against the brick facades of Beacon Hill. The journey to the courthouse was both salvation and nightmare. The children pressed their faces to the wind, marveling at horses, carriages, street lamps, sights they had only read about in books. The world was larger than the attic had promised, and yet far more terrifying. Every stranger's stare felt like an intrusion, every shout a reminder that they were not free, they were spectacle. At the courthouse, the magistrates convened swiftly. This was not merely scandal, it was civic theater. Boston's elite filled the chamber, whispering feverishly. The press crammed into every corner. The Thorne family, once untouchable, was now the city's obsession. Elias was brought forth in chains, a sight so shocking that even his rivals gasped. Never had they imagined the unmovable patriarch bound like a criminal. The charges read aloud were damning: unlawful confinement, cruelty, perversion of parental duty. Elias stood silent, eyes burning, but his silence no longer commanded respect. It condemned him. When asked for his plea, he finally spoke. "I did what was necessary. I did what honor required. I preserved the Thorne name." His words, intended as justification, rang instead as confession. Eleanor took the stand. Trembling, she recounted years of silence, the weight of complicity, the diary she had kept as witness to her own torment. Her words broke the chamber. Even those who had whispered judgment now wept openly. Her testimony transformed her from accomplice to victim, from ornament to tragic heroine. The city saw in her not only betrayal, but survival. Then came Silas. Though his voice was halting, though words came to him like broken glass, he spoke with a clarity that silenced the chamber. He described nights without stars, days without sun, dreams that reached only as far as the ceiling beams. His testimony was not polished, not rhetorical, but it was truth in its rawest form. And it shattered the last remnants of Elias's defense. Beatrice, too frail to speak, placed the diary on the judge's desk. Its pages, filled with Eleanor's trembling hand, became the final nail in the coffin of silence. The court did not need more. The truth was written in ink, lived in flesh, carried in the trembling of two children who had survived what should have broken them. The verdict was inevitable. Elias Thorne, once Boston's most respected patriarch, was declared guilty. The sentence, life imprisonment, stripped of titles, stripped of honor. The name he had sought to preserve now lay in ruins, spoken only with disgust and horror. The children were freed, but freedom is never simple. For them, the world was not salvation but a storm. They had been dragged from silence into spectacle, from shadows into fire. And as they left the courthouse carried by their mother's arms, the crowd roared, not in celebration but in something darker: curiosity, hunger, the need to consume tragedy as entertainment. The attic was open, the silence was broken, but the true imprisonment was only beginning. The courtroom emptied, but the echoes lingered. Elias had been led away in chains, his face pale yet unbroken, as though the bars that awaited him were merely another kind of throne. Eleanor clutched her children, believing for a brief and trembling moment that the nightmare had ended. Yet outside those stone walls, Boston waited, not with compassion, but with hunger. The doors opened to chaos. A wall of flashing cameras, shouting reporters, and gawking citizens pressed forward like a tidal wave. Their pens scratched feverishly, their lenses clicked, their questions sliced through the air. "What were you fed?" one barked at Silas. "Did you ever see sunlight?" another shouted at Beatrice. "Were you beaten? Were you starved? Did your father hurt you?" The questions were not for answers. They were for spectacle, morsels of horror to be devoured by the morning paper. Beatrice clung to Eleanor's skirts, trembling under the assault of voices. Silas's jaw tightened. He wanted to scream, to drive them all back into silence, but the words refused him. Instead, he glared, his pale eyes sharp with fury, a boy confronting a world that wanted him not as a person, but as a headline. The family was whisked away by carriage, but the crowd followed, pressing close, surrounding them like predators circling prey. When they finally reached the Thorne mansion, they found it besieged. Neighbors who once bowed to Elias now hurled stones at the windows, their faces twisted in righteous fury. Others watched silently, eyes glittering with curiosity, their children perched on shoulders to glimpse the fallen dynasty. Inside, the house felt cavernous, oppressive. The grand hall that once smelled of polish and candle wax now reeked of mildew and dust, abandoned by servants who fled after the scandal. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors seemed to sneer down at Eleanor and her children, as if condemning them for shattering the family's facade. The silence of the house was no comfort. It was heavier, almost accusing. That night, Eleanor tried to soothe them with lullabies she hadn't sung in years. Beatrice clung to her mother's chest, finally able to sleep. But Silas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing with his eyes the cracks that spiderwebbed above him. He realized with sudden horror that freedom was not the opposite of the attic. It was simply a larger room, filled with people who still wished to keep him caged in their own way. The following weeks proved it true. Newspapers carried grotesque sketches of the children, exaggerating their pallor, their hollow eyes, their ghost-like forms. Some papers called them the Wraiths of Beacon Hill. Others printed sermons declaring their survival a miracle, proof of God's hand in preserving innocence. Ministers thundered from pulpits about sin in the high houses. Women gathered in parlors to speculate about what the children had eaten, whether they had spoken in their confinement, whether they were mad. Charitable committees arrived at the mansion bearing baskets of food, bolts of cloth, even dolls for Beatrice. But their gifts came with eyes that measured, judged, and whispered. "Poor lambs," one woman sighed, pressing a bonnet into Beatrice's hands, then turning to whisper to her companion, "Do you see how pale she is, like a corpse that walks?" Silas despised them. He refused the gifts, refused to speak, refused even to look at the women who gawked at his sister as though she were a relic. When one newspaperman dared to sketch Beatrice as she played in the garden, Silas hurled a rock at him, striking his notebook from his hand. "Savage!" the man shouted, but Silas only stood taller, chest heaving, his silence speaking volumes. Eleanor tried to shield them, but she was not spared either. Boston, which had once envied her beauty and grace, now painted her as either victim or conspirator. Some pitied her as a mother trapped by her husband's tyranny. Others scorned her for complicity, sneering that she had allowed her children to rot while she dined in parlors and wore silk gowns. Every step she took was measured by eyes that refused to let her forget her guilt. The greatest torment came from the church. Ministers descended upon the Thorne name like carrion birds, using the scandal as proof of the dangers of pride and secrecy. Some called the attic a dungeon of sin. Others claimed the children had been preserved as living martyrs. Silas and Beatrice were paraded before congregations, made to sit in pews while strangers craned their necks to glimpse them, whispering prayers not out of compassion, but curiosity. One evening, Eleanor found Silas sitting alone in the ruined library, his hands trembling as he tore pages from Elias's books. She tried to stop him, but he snarled, not with words, but with a guttural sound that froze her. His eyes burned with a fury too old for his young face. "They'll never let us be," he finally whispered, the first words he had spoken in days. "We'll always be their monsters." Eleanor's heart broke, but she could not deny the truth. Freedom had not given her children peace. It had given them a new kind of cage, built not of wood and nails, but of gossip and judgment. Beatrice fared no better. She began to grow ill, coughing fits that rattled her small frame, fevers that left her delirious. Doctors came and went, shaking their heads. "She is too frail," they murmured. "The confinement has left her body weak." Eleanor wept at her bedside, singing lullabies between prayers, while Silas sat silently in the corner, glaring at the world that had broken his sister before it had even known her name. As Beatrice drifted in and out of fevered dreams, she clutched Eleanor's diary. She whispered that the words inside were the only proof they had existed as more than curiosities. "Promise me, Mama," she begged. "Promise me you'll keep writing, so they know we were real, not just ghosts in a story." Eleanor promised, though her hands shook as she held the pen. Each word she wrote carried the weight of survival and betrayal. She documented not only what Elias had done, but what Boston was doing still, how the city consumed her children's pain as if it were theatre. Silas, meanwhile, began to wander the mansion at night. He traced the halls, touched the velvet curtains, stared at portraits until the faces blurred. He whispered to himself, fragments of sentences, practicing words he rarely dared to speak aloud. He was determined to master language, not for conversation, but for testimony. One day, he swore silently, he would tell the world the truth in a way no reporter or minister could twist. But Boston was not patient. Rumors swirled that Elias, even in prison, commanded loyalty from men of influence. Whispers claimed he would appeal, that he would reclaim his fortune, that the Thorne name would rise again. Others whispered darker tales, that the children were cursed, that their blood carried madness, that they should never have been released from their attic at all. The Thorne secret was no longer hidden, but it was far from finished. Winter came early that year, draping Boston in a bitter frost that clung to every street corner and seeped into the marrow of the city. Inside the Thorne mansion, the fireplaces roared, but the cold would not leave. It was not the kind of cold that crept in through cracked windows or poorly sealed doors. It was the cold of absence, of dread, of something broken that no flame could repair. Beatrice lay in her bed, her skin translucent against the linen sheets. Her cough rattled the silence at night, echoing through the empty corridors. Each fit left her weaker, her lips trembling as though she might whisper, but often no sound came. When Eleanor begged the doctors for remedies, they spoke in hushed tones, offering syrups and tonics that did little. Her lungs, one admitted at last, were never meant for the world. Years without air, without sun. It is a miracle she survived this long. Silas refused to believe it. He sat by her bed, clutching her hand so tightly she sometimes winced, though she never pulled away. "You'll get better," he whispered again and again, his voice rough with the effort of forming words. "You have to." He told her about the world beyond, the carriages he had glimpsed, the ships in the harbour, the horses that clattered on cobblestones. He promised that when she was stronger, he would take her to see them all. Beatrice only smiled faintly, as though she knew something he did not. Outside, the city was restless. The trial had ended, but Elias Thorne's shadow lingered. Even behind bars, his name carried weight. Letters arrived at the mansion, some from sympathizers demanding his release, others from enemies demanding his execution. Threats scrawled in ink dripped with venom. "The Thorne children are cursed. Keep them hidden. Or, release Elias, or you'll pay in blood." Eleanor burned most of them, but Silas sometimes retrieved the ashes, staring at the blackened scraps until the words reformed in his mind. And then came the rumors, whispers in taverns and parlors that Elias was, not truly imprisoned, that he lived comfortably, bribing guards, dictating letters, even sending instructions to loyalists. Some claimed he had a journal, a great book filled with his philosophy, his justifications for what he had done. He calls it the Testament, one paper reported breathlessly, and he swears it will outlive the lies told against him. Whether truth or invention, the rumor spread like fire, rekindling his presence in every home that dared to speak his name. Silas heard it too. He listened from the shadows when Eleanor tried to shield him, his anger simmering. The man who had stolen his childhood was not gone. He was whispering still, poisoning the city like smoke curling under a door. Sometimes Silas dreamed of him. Elias's face leaning close, his voice echoing in the dark. "You are mine. No matter what they say, no matter where you go, you are mine." One night, Silas crept into the study where Eleanor had hidden the remaining letters. By candlelight he read them, his eyes moving slowly, painfully across the words. Supporters wrote of Elias as though he were a prophet, a man misunderstood by lesser minds. They claimed the children were weak branches, pruned to protect the tree. Others went further, insisting Silas and Beatrice should be returned to him, that they belonged under his guidance, not corrupted by the sympathy of outsiders. The words made Silas tremble, not from fear, but from rage. He slammed the letters into the fire, watching them curl and blacken, the ink dissolving into smoke. "He won't have us," he whispered, clutching the mantle until his knuckles whitened. "Not ever again." But rage could not cure Beatrice. Her illness deepened. Nights became battles against the air itself, her breath shallow and ragged. Eleanor sat vigil, her beauty withered into exhaustion, her once bright eyes hollowed by grief. Silas rarely left her side, except to pace the corridors like a sentry, as though he could ward off death by sheer defiance. It was during one of those nights that Silas discovered something hidden. Searching the attic, not the children's prison, but another long unused, he found a trunk sealed with rusted locks. Inside were Elias's journals, pages upon pages filled with cramped handwriting, diagrams, sketches of the mansion, even notations of the children's diets and responses to his experiments in silence. Silas read with shaking hands, his stomach twisting. His father had not merely confined them, he had documented them like specimens. They were not his children, they were his study. In one entry, Elias had written, "Silas shows promise. His silence is not weakness but strength. He listens deeper than others. If honed, he will surpass me." Another entry described Beatrice as fragile, her survival uncertain. "If she withers, it will be no fault of mine. The strong endure, the weak fade." Silas slammed the journal shut, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to burn it, to erase every word, but something held him back. The city already whispered of Elias's testament. Perhaps these journals were part of it. Perhaps destroying them would erase proof of what had truly been done. Silas made a choice. He would keep them, not as tribute but as weapon. One day he would use his father's words against him. Meanwhile, Beatrice drifted further from the world. Sometimes she spoke of dreams where the attic returned, not as prison, but as sanctuary. "It was quiet there," she whispered weakly. "Too quiet. But at least it was ours." Silas begged her not to speak that way, but she only smiled, her fingers brushing his cheek. "Don't be angry, Silas. Promise me you'll live, for both of us." When the first snow fell, covering the city in white silence, Beatrice's breath finally failed her. Eleanor's wail echoed through the mansion, a sound that cracked walls more than any hammer. Silas stood frozen, unable to cry, unable to breathe, staring at his sister's still form. She had been his other half, his mirror in the dark. Without her, the silence felt heavier, suffocating. Boston mourned in its own way. Newspapers printed sketches of Beatrice in angelic repose, calling her the ghost child of Beacon Hill. Sermons declared her death a symbol of purity lost. Strangers lined the streets during her funeral procession, some weeping, others gawking, all feeding on the spectacle. For them, Beatrice was story, symbol, tragedy. For Silas, she was the last piece of himself. At the graveside, as earth fell upon the coffin, Silas whispered, "I'll speak for you. I'll tell them all. They'll know who you were." His voice broke, but it carried a vow etched into the winter air, and somewhere, behind prison walls, Elias Thorne surely smiled. For even in death, his children remained bound to him, by grief, by silence, by the endless shadow of his name. The Thorne mansion became a mausoleum. Curtains stayed drawn, dust gathered unchecked, and the once bustling halls echoed only with Eleanor's footsteps and Silas's silence. Beatrice's room remained untouched, her toys, her ribbons, her diary stacked neatly by her bedside, waiting for a hand that would never return. Eleanor would sit there for hours, staring at the empty bed, her lips moving in prayer, though her voice rarely rose above a whisper. Silas wandered the house like a phantom. He no longer feared the silence. It was all he had left. At night, he crept into the attic, not the prison where he and Beatrice had lived, but the old study where Elias's journals lay hidden. By candlelight he read, scrawling notes of his own in the margins, crossing out lies with jagged strokes of ink. Each page was a battlefield, Elias's philosophy of control and purity against Silas's growing determination to dismantle it. The city, however, would not leave the Thorne family buried in its shadows. Reporters still lingered outside the gates, sketching silhouettes of Silas at the window. Pamphlets circulated, claiming Elias was writing his great work from prison, smuggling it out page by page. They called it the Testament of Elias Thorne. Ministers quoted fragments, whether real or invented, in sermons. "Discipline is mercy," one shouted to his congregation, "and indulgence is decay." The word spread like infection. Silas began to realize his father's imprisonment had not killed his influence. It had sanctified it. Elias was no longer merely a man, he was becoming myth, and myths could not be chained. At 15, Silas stood taller than most men, his frame lean but unyielding. His silence, once a mark of frailty, had hardened into presence. When he walked through the city with Eleanor, people parted without realizing why. His eyes carried an intensity that made strangers shiver. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were sharp, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Boston's intellectuals began to notice. A professor from Harvard invited Silas to lecture halls, not as a student, but as specimen, a mind shaped by silence. Silas listened to their debates, their polished speeches, their endless rhetoric, and felt only disgust. Words had been his father's weapon, twisted into chains. He resolved to wield them differently, not to bind, but to expose. One winter evening, Silas asked Eleanor for the diary she had kept all those years. She hesitated, clutching it to her chest, fearing that giving it to him would reopen wounds, but he looked at her with Beatrice's eyes, pleading, insistent, and she relented. "If you speak, Silas," she whispered, "speak for her, speak for us, but never for him." Silas nodded, though in his heart he knew the truth. To destroy Elias, he would have to speak of him more than anyone else ever dared. By 16, Silas published anonymously in the papers. Short, cutting essays appeared under titles like On the Nature of Silence and Children of the Attic. They did not sensationalize, they accused, they described in cold, precise language the experiments Elias had conducted, the cruelty masked as duty, the city's complicity in worshipping men like him. Readers were shaken, not by tales of horror, but by the mirror Silas held up to them. "Did you not watch?" he wrote. "Did you not bow? Did you not whisper as we withered?" The essays spread. Some praised their brilliance. Others condemned them as fabrications, slanders against a man of honor. Elias's supporters seized upon them, twisting them into proof that Silas was ungrateful, corrupted by the sympathy of the weak. The war of words deepened. And then Elias himself struck back. From prison came the first fragments of the Testament. Smuggled pages appeared in salons, read aloud in taverns. Elias wrote of order, sacrifice, purity of blood, the weakness of sentiment. He described his children not as victims, but as experiments that proved his theories of strength and decay. "Silas," he wrote, "is my finest work. He resists, not because I failed, but because I succeeded." Silas read these words with fire in his veins. To his father, he was not a son but a creation, a proof of concept. Elias had stolen Beatrice's life, and now he sought to claim even Silas's defiance as his triumph. It was then Silas resolved that silence was no longer enough. He would speak, not in whispers, not in margins, but in a voice that shook the city. He would drag Elias's myth into the light and burn it. The hall was packed, every bench filled, the aisles crowded, the windows lined with faces pressing against the glass. Word had spread that Silas Thorne, the boy of the attic, the ghost child grown to manhood, was to speak publicly for the first time. Ministers, journalists, professors, mothers and beggars alike gathered, driven by equal parts pity and hunger. They came not for truth, but for spectacle. Silas stood at the front, his black coat hanging loose on his tall frame. Eleanor sat in the shadows, hands clasped tightly, lips moving in silent prayer. She had begged him not to do this, fearing the weight of her husband's shadow, but Silas had only said, "If I stay silent, he wins." The hall hushed as he placed a stack of papers on the podium. His hands trembled only once before steadying. For a moment he looked out at the crowd, eyes wide, mouths parted, and he saw not strangers but judges, the same as those who had stared at him when he first stepped from the attic. This time, he would not be their curiosity, he would be their accuser. He began to read. His voice was low at first, rough from disuse, but it grew steadier with every word. He recited passages from Elias's journals, the diets, the experiments, the cold notations of his children's suffering. Gasps rippled through the hall. He read of Beatrice, how Elias had marked her as weak, disposable. The crowd wept. Then Silas lifted his gaze and spoke not from the papers, but from himself. "You ask why I was silent," he said. "It was because silence was the only truth left to me. In silence, I learned to see what words can hide. My father's words chained this city. You all listened, you all obeyed, and in your obedience you became his accomplices." Murmurs rose, some in agreement, others in protest. A minister shouted, "Blasphemy! You dishonor your father!" Silas's eyes flashed. "I have no father," he thundered, "only a jailer who called himself by that name, and if you honor him still, then you are no better than he." The hall erupted, shouts, sobs, the scrape of benches, but Silas did not falter. He raised his hand, and somehow the noise broke into silence. "My sister is dead," he said softly. "Not because God willed it, not because nature failed her, but because this city allowed a man to call cruelty honor. If you will remember her, do not call her an angel. Do not make her a symbol. Remember her as a child who wanted only to live." When he finished, the hall was silent. Then the applause came, not thunderous, but hesitant, fractured, as though the crowd itself was ashamed. Some rose to leave, unable to bear his gaze. Others pressed forward, desperate to touch him, to claim a piece of his defiance as their own. In the weeks that followed, Silas's speech spread in print, copied by hand, whispered in taverns. Some hailed him as a prophet of truth, others cursed him as a traitor to his blood. But none could ignore him. Elias's testament was no longer unopposed. It was shadowed by the testimony of the son he had sought to shape. And yet, victory was hollow. Silas returned to the mansion, to Beatrice's empty room, to the journals that reeked of his father's voice. No speech, no applause, no ink could return what was lost. He had struck Elias's myth, but myths die slowly, and some even grow stronger when attacked. Eleanor died quietly the following spring, worn thin by grief. At her funeral, Silas stood alone, taller now than any man present, his silence deeper than words. He carried her diary in his coat, along with Elias's journals, the twin testaments of his family, one written in pain, the other in cruelty. Years later, when people spoke of Silas Thorne, they disagreed on who he truly was. Some said he was a savior, a voice that broke the silence of tyranny. Others claimed he was cursed, a living echo of his father's madness. Children dared each other to walk past the Thorne mansion, whispering that the ghost boy still haunted its halls. But those who heard him speak, even once, never forgot. His words lingered, unsettling, undeniable. And perhaps that was his final victory, not to erase the silence, but to teach the world that silence itself had a voice. In the end, the Thorne name was neither preserved nor destroyed. It became legend, a shadow cast across Boston, a reminder whispered in the dark. That silence can be a prison. That silence can be a weapon, and that silence, once broken, can never be contained again.